watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
It's been a hard period of late for the Israeli people, the state of Israel, and really for the Jewish people as a whole. First, there was the tragedy in Itamar when terrorists broke into a settlement on the West Bank and took the lives of 5 Israelis, a mother, father, and 3 children. And then as we're taping now, very recently, again a bomb exploded near the central bus station in Israel, an Israeli bus stop. And it took the life of at least 1 Israeli, injured scores more, 30-some people. And it not only rocked the state of Israel to some extent, it rocks world Jewry. And so we wanted to speak to an Israeli and representative of the Israeli government here in New York, just for some feeling about how is the nation of Israel now responding, and what does this most recent resurgence, in a sense, of violence inflicted against the Israeli people, what does it mean to the Israeli today? And so I'm honored to speak with Gil Lanier, who is Consul for Public Affairs at the Israeli Consulate in New York. Gil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Gil, the first question is, how did you hear about this latest bombing in Jerusalem? What was your immediate reaction?
Well, first of all, I've heard about it pretty much like everybody here. It happened during rush hour yesterday morning for all of us. And, you know, you look at it, you see where it is. Your immediate thought, of course, is to your immediate family, the friends you know. This is not very far from the foreign ministry in Jerusalem. It's a bus station a lot of people use. So first you think about the people you know immediately, but then right away you start thinking about, generally speaking, what does it mean? Are we facing something like this again? And it brings up back memories from the early 2000s and, of course, from the late 90s when we had similar incidents in Israel. Thank God, and luckily we didn't have attacks of this type for quite a while in Israel. So, but this, you know, right away it brings back the memories and the feelings.
And I want you to speak more about the fact that this seemed to have been in the past. That for a while there were regular suicide bombers who rained down terror inside Israel. And then the security fence goes up, and there was a feeling that Israel had gone past that. And I wonder now, when you talk to your own colleagues, what's their sense now? What's the real concern now? And do you feel this is the start of a new pattern, or do you feel this is an isolated event?
This is not an isolated event in the sense that there is a rise in terror attacks, and there is a rise in violence in the last few weeks, I would say. You know, the shooting from Gaza, the shelling of rockets into Israel, the mortars being shot from Gaza. This hasn't stopped, in fact, for a minute, but we've seen a considerable increase in the last few weeks. And I think that's the backdrop of the entire thing, is that you see an escalation. We've had Grad rockets in Ashkelon, in Beersheba. We had in Ashdod again. We've seen the attempt to smuggle arms from Iran vis-a-vis Syria to the Gaza Strip. Again, very deadly weapons that would have been used against Israelis, against innocent civilians. So yeah, we see a trend. You see a trend of terror activities which hasn't subsided. It hasn't stopped. And in the last few weeks, we see some sort of escalation in the situation, which is very concerning.
Mm-hmm. What do you feel the response of the international community has been to the escalation of rocket attacks and now to the bombing in Jerusalem following the terrorist attack in Itamar, both here in the United States and in Europe? Have you felt that world leaders have been supportive enough?
Well, I think that world leaders to the world leaders, it's clear. To the world in general, I think it's clear that we are determined to do whatever it takes to protect our citizens, and that while we are committed to peace on one hand, security goes hand in hand with that. And I think that world leaders understand the significance or the meaning of rising violence or rising terror attacks against Israelis. Nothing can justify this. Not causing the world can justify this. This is indiscriminatory. You mentioned at the beginning that Israelis were injured. Well, not only Israelis were injured. The woman who died in Jerusalem is a British citizen, and there are a few Americans who are between the wounded. So this is not harming Israelis. It's harming civilians and innocent people all over the world, not only in Israel, unfortunately. It affects all of us. I think that if anything should be learned from that or should be derived from that is that we need to stand united against those people, against people who try and use the most brutal methods of terror and based on incitement and misguided ideas or thoughts that through violence, through indiscriminatory violence, they'll be able to pull us away from what we're trying to achieve, which is basically peace, coexistence, stability, and calm to the entire region.
I am sometimes personally offended, and again, I am not an Israeli. I'm a Jew, and I think American Jewry identifies with and feels in solidarity with the people of Israel as one Jewish people. And so when I hear of an attack at Itamar, or I hear about a bomb going off at a bus station, even though I'm not an Israeli, I feel enormous empathy, and I feel in some way, by the way, the attacks against me too. It must be multiple times more, that feeling, for the Israeli himself or herself. But I am personally offended then when any attempt is made to create a moral equivalency, as if to say there are Israeli extremists and Palestinian extremists. And when an event like the bombing in the bus station occurs, I am offended if I hear a world leader say, we regret the loss of life of the Israelis, we regret that there is a terrorist attack, we condemn the terrorist attack, but there are terrorist attacks and there are extremists on both sides of this problem. And I feel that no matter what Israel needs to do to protect itself in a military way, Israelis don't sneak into homes and slay children in their beds. Israelis don't plant bombs in civilian bus stations. And that there is something inappropriate, Gil, about making a moral equivalency. I recognize you are a formal diplomat representing the State of Israel. There are things you just cannot say on camera that you might say to your wife or your friends privately. But I want you to address this issue as best you can. How do you react when you hear world leaders make a moral equivalency when they describe and react to an event like the bombing at the Jerusalem bus station?
Well, I think to equate or moral equivalency between what's happening to us and other events is ridiculous. You know, and you mentioned it so well in what you said. I wouldn't even start beginning to describe the difference. If the people don't understand that difference, then they don't really know what Israel's all about. And we're about freedom and democracy and equality, and we're a nation and a law-abiding nation. And what we're facing is a terror organization. It's a bunch of people armed to their teeth by countries in the region who have their own interests, which are very foreign to the interests we just mentioned, or to the moral foundations which Israel, the United States, other Western democracies are based on. It's a huge difference. It's a sea of it's an ocean of difference. And there stands the main issue. It's not a question of moral equivalency. It's a question of understanding who are you facing. What are you facing? They're talking now about reconciliation between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas. The Hamas is a terror organization which hijacked over 1 million people in the Gaza Strip. They're prisoners. They are Gilad Shalit is a prisoner within a country of prisoners. They are prisoners of their own government. They are hostages of their own government. The people in Gaza are hostages of Hamas, which is a violent organization. It's a terror organization who does not recognize the right of Israel to exist, who does not recognize any agreements Israel signed with its neighbors, who refuses until this very day to negotiate or at least agree on negotiating rather than retreating to violence under every possible or at every possible point in time. And all those things that the Hamas stands for, all those principles so-called that the Hamas stands for, makes it a terror organization. They're criminals. And people who support criminals are also criminals. And if a country backs the Hamas or backs Hezbollah or aids and abates them with weapons, with smuggling, with security, with the security apparatuses, with training, with coaching, with incitement, these people are as guilty as the people who are doing it. This incitement has to stop. This culture of which our blood as Israelis is different than somebody else's blood has to stop. This is something that we've been talking about for years. The issue of incitement has been raised by Israel time and again. Unfortunately, time and again, it's been rejected. And time and again, we see the fruits of that. Nobody can explain logically or in any way, shape, or form something like what happened in Itamar. This is the most horrific way of brutality. Nobody can really relate to that in any way, shape, or form. How can this be justified? How can somebody justify putting a bomb in a bus station before people board the bus? Is there a question of moral equivalency here? I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. And when Palestinian Authority is talking about reconciliation with Hamas, with an organization that uses those tactics, that declares it doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist, or let's put it this way, refuses to declare that Israel has a right to exist, that me as an Israeli, as a Jew, have a right to live in my homeland just as much as anybody else does, what does it tell you? The question is, where is the Palestinian Authority going with this? Reconciliation is great, but on whose account? I think these are the questions we need to ask ourselves, not necessarily talk about whether it's morally equivalent, because it's not. I don't think the question is there even. If somebody seriously tries to compare Israel and the self-defense actions Israel takes with the terror attacks, I would just reject it flat out, without even going into an argument. There is no argument to be made.
Gil, I want to push you one moment. You will hear some American Jews argue that when Israel launches an attack against an installation in Gaza, as recently happened, and there were civilian casualties in that Israeli attack, that is the moral equivalency. What do you say to them?
First and foremost, again, I flatly reject the allegation or the accusation or the equivalency, but see what happens. After the massacre in Itamar, people were handing out candy in the streets of Gaza. This is what they were doing. This was the Palestinian reaction. After this unfortunate event that happened in Gaza with the shelling, Israel's reaction was of compassion, of sorrow, of the regret of loss of human lives. We immediately explain what happened. We immediately explain the situation. Of course, we investigate everything that happens in that nature. And of course, both Prime Minister and other people, other officials in the Israeli government expressed their sorrow for the loss of lives. When civilians casualties occur in a situation like that, Israel's reaction is so different than what you see on the other side, unfortunately, that I think it highlights right away the difference. The other thing you should always ask yourselves is what were the civilians doing there, in the sense that what were the people who are instigating the attacks against Israel were doing behind civilians. The issue of using civilians as human shield is raised time and again by Israel. Again, unfortunately, not addressed properly by the international community. Again, unfortunately, not getting the attention it should get. If a terror organization is capable of digging a tunnel or a bunker underneath a house, or a hospital for that matter, or a school, or a daycare, or a commercial center, or whatever it is, in order to hide weapons inside, in order to later on launch them from the vicinity of those areas, Sometimes, unfortunately, it puts people in harm's way. It puts the civilians in harm's way. Don't forget that Israel, probably the only country in the world that goes to the measures that we do when we, unfortunately, have to retaliate to the attacks against us. Pamphlets, SMS, text messaging, radio notifications. We use methods that no other army in the world, and I can tell you that for sure because I've spoken to people in different governments, and they say, on private, of course, they will tell you in private conversation, nobody goes to the measure that Israel goes to prevent civilian losses. We will never use a term like collateral damage. We don't think it's collateral damage. We think that every life lost is terrible. We lament every person that loses his life as a consequence of the conflict or in any other situation. However, when it happens, we make sure to investigate and make sure it doesn't happen again. We don't hand candy out on the street.
Gil, do you hate Palestinians?
No, I don't. Certainly don't. I could hate certain people for the harm they inflict, but I don't hate people just because they're Palestinians. It's just as much as I don't hate people because they're Irish or Mexican or anything else. I don't hate Iranians.
But the Palestinian people are trying to hurt you.
Well, the people who are trying to hurt me, I will come out against with everything I have. If you know, Akam le'orgecha, Ashkem le'orgo, we say, and we know why we say it. But explain. Okay, let's translate that a little bit, but in a very loose way. Those who seek to destroy you, make sure you destroy them first.
Exactly right.
But the people who do that sometimes are so misguided. You know, you stop somebody and you ask him, he tells you, I hate you as an Israeli, I hate you as a Jew. And when you start digging, why do you hate me? You never met me in your life. You've never met, so many people have never met a Jew in their life. And yet they hate all Jews, or they hate Israelis, or they hate all the Americans. They've never met an American in their lives. Why? Because the culture is such that allows the incitement and the lies to go on and on and on. So I don't hate people because what they are. I don't hate people for their affiliation or for their background or for their racial origin. I try not to hate in general. Of course, if somebody is violent towards you, if somebody is expressing terrible feelings towards you, then unfortunately you need to defend yourself. But other than that, I don't hate people. I grow up hoping nobody hates me and do the best to take away from the hatred that I meet, unfortunately, in my line of work, which sometimes I do.
To what extent do you think Palestinian people, in fact, do hate Israelis in general?
I don't think they do.
You don't think they do?
Let me tell you, what I did before I came here last summer, for the past year or so, I was working in the Bureau for Middle Eastern Economy in the Foreign Ministry, where what we mainly do is try and remove blocks on trade between Israel and its neighbors, or Israel and other countries in the region. Try and help people who want to do business, and evidently this is increasing. And I've met people from Jordan, I've met people from Egypt, I've met a lot of Palestinians throughout the last year. They're people just like you and me. You know, we sit and talk and we joke and we had dinner and then we went out and we did everything. I don't believe that this idea of somebody hating me. I've yet to meet somebody who would hate me after he knows me. Let's put it this way. But not me personally. I mean in a more general way. I think that there is a complete lack of knowledge of what Israel is all about. I think that most people in the countries around us have no idea what Israel really stands for. And when you try and tell them that, when you open them to what Israel is, and of course if they come to Israel it's the best, but unfortunately it's very rare that they do. But once they do decide to make the trip to Israel and come and see for themselves and come and see the people they will do business with later, or see Tel Aviv, or go to Jerusalem, they're fascinated. They love it. They can't believe. They will never tell you that to your face, but you know, I know what's going on in their mind, and sometimes they will say, it's very different than what I thought it is. It's not what I thought, it's not what I believed it is. So again, I strongly believe that most people don't hate us just for what we are. I think that people are misguided, they are mistaught, nobody teaches them the truth about the situation. And of course, it's very convenient for some elements to keep hanging everything on Israel and Israel's existence. As if Israel disappears tomorrow from the face of the earth, every problem will be solved. This is not the case. I know it, you know it. I just wish that more people around us, especially in the neighborhood that we live in, will get a better knowledge of what we're for, what we stand for. But again, Again, being the only democracy in the Middle East, being the only country in the Middle East that you actually can freely speak your mind, makes a huge difference. It allows people who criticize Israel from within Israel to get an echo. It also allows us to tell you the great things we do tell you about Israel and trying to expose you to the things we try to expose you about. Why is Israel great? Why is Israel, and I strongly believe it, by the way, why is Israel one of the single most significant success stories of the 20th century? How come after 63 years we went from 500,000 people to over 7.5 million people, various religions, various backgrounds, etc., and we're moving forward, not without problems, not without issues, but we're moving forward, we're going somewhere. This is the story I want to tell people. This is why I came here. This is the story I want to tell people. This is why I joined the foreign ministry when I did. I'm trying to tell the success story Israel is. When it comes to the countries around me, it's very hard to get the message through, and sometimes it seems that nobody is listening. But I know people are listening, and I'm very optimistic about that.
You're a wonderful spokesperson for Israel, and this is the first time I've had the chance of speaking with you on camera. We met off camera, but you're wonderful. Then I want you to address something that I hear again all the time. The argument that we hear coming out of Israel is that the anger and resentment at the Palestinian Authority is for its apparent reluctance to stop the incitement, and that there's always the suggestion we get from Israeli leaders that one of the obstacles to peace is that the Palestinian Authority has not changed the rhetoric that the Palestinian learns growing up in a Palestinian land, whether it's the West Bank, Gaza, whatever. And therefore we assume that this is sort of a widespread Palestinian orientation to buy into the anti-Israel rhetoric, and that it does engender hatred, a desire to destroy the state of Israel, if not to destroy Jews. And you're describing something they're very different. So I want you to help me understand the extent to which incitement is really a problem, or is it a very narrow problem that affects only a small percentage of the Palestinian population?
Incitement is a very widespread problem. Thank God it affects only part of the public or its target audience. Or let's put it this way. People will assume things, but when they're forced to meet with you face to face and they see other things, there's a change of reality. But you know, when you're 15 or 14 or 13 and you're taught certain things in school, or you're being, shown certain things on TV, and you live in a culture that glorifies suicide bombers and makes them martyrs and all that, you grow up. When you're 15, 16, 17, you're not fully aware of what's going on. You make a choice, and sometimes it's a very, very misguided choice, and there's no turning back. I mean, you could grow up with that incitement, and sometimes it won't catch up, or it won't have the influence that the people who instigated hope for. And then, if we'll have a chance to meet, or if there'll be a chance where you'd meet Israelis, or meet Israelis face to face through business or through work or whatever it is, you will have a chance to understand, and it's not like you thought it is. At least it's a little bit different, if not more, than what you thought. On the other hand, it's keep going and going and going. So it's not like everybody's brainwashed, but of course people are influenced by it, and there is a culture, and the culture exists. And on one hand, you see Palestinians trading with Israel, and you see the trade between Israel and the Palestinian Authority growing in the last few years. And yet, on the other hand, there is a call to boycott Israeli products. Begins with allegedly more limited boycott, and now generally, as we warned at the beginning, both the Palestinians and the international community, it escalates. Now it's a general call to boycott Israeli products. On the one hand, they trade with us, they buy, they sell. On the other hand, there's a call to boycott. And does it make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. Is it logical? No. But this is the mixture of what we do, of the way of life we have. We believe, we understand, we see that if the incitement would be eradicated earlier on, I mean, and if people would just, if we had nipped it at the bud, in the sense that people would go to school and learn other things, then again to the glorification of this culture of hate and violence, then the influence would be a preventive one of people who are turning to this way of terror and violence. The influence will be preventive in the sense that they would just not do it. It will be preemptive. It must be preempted in an earlier stage. If you let it grow, if you let it continue, God knows where we're going to be.
You told me you don't hate Palestinians.
Absolutely.
You seem to say you know Palestinians who don't hate Israelis.
Yes, I've met.
Hamas, Hezbollah aside, is there any reason why Israelis and Palestinians can't live side by side in peace?
I don't see a reason why we can't live in peace at the end of the process or at the end of the road.
And do you think I would find Palestinians who would say the exact same thing?
I believe you could. I believe they would have a hard time saying it in public.
Why?
Because of the culture, because it's different, because of the environment, because of the fact that I come from a free country with a free society, and I'm not worried and I'm not afraid that somebody would knock on my sister's door at 3 a.m. because I said I don't know any Palestinian that hates me, and they don't. They left, if they're out of Gaza or the Palestinian Authority, you always hear they have to think about the people who are there. And if they are there, you know how it is. We know exactly how it is. We've seen Hamas using death squad on people. We've seen what happened right after they took power in Gaza, throwing people off rooftops, etc. It's not Switzerland, let's put it this way. So and it's not even something else. It's not free. It's not. If people grow up in a culture where they are not feeling that they are free to say their mind, they will have a hard time doing it. And it takes a lot of conditioning and a lot of change in mindset to allow them to do it. I think it's our role as neighbors to continue to be a role model in a sense of how a democracy or a free country operates, with all the differences, with all the difficulties, with all the arguments, with all the fact that you can't put two Israelis in a room without starting shouting at each other 3 minutes afterwards. That's a given, you know, we grow up with that, but we also grow up with the fact that I can tell you whatever I think. I can tell you my mind. I go into my boss's office, I tell him whatever I think I should tell him right away, and I'm not afraid. That's the culture we try and promote in Israel. The true essence of freedom is speaking your mind. Of course, with the limitation that you don't harm somebody else's right to do so, etc. If you grow in Gaza, needless to say, but also if you grow in the West Bank, it's not the same thing. This is not the same situation. It's not the same condition. So it's getting better in the West Bank, I think, in some parts, in many areas. You see the difference. You see people changing, you see adaptations, you see more media outlets, but again, if the top doesn't signal that it's legitimate to be, I wouldn't expect them to be pro-Israelis or Israel sympathizers overnight. I don't expect them that at all. But if the government or if the people who are running the show are not signaling to their own people, it's okay to stop the hate speech when you talk about Israelis. It's okay to do business with Israel. It's okay to talk to Israelis, to meet Israelis, to dream together. It's not going to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And that's the main difference.
You already said, when Israel unfortunately takes the lives of civilians, there is anguish within not only the Israeli people, but there are expressions of empathy, sympathy, even regret from within the Israeli government. After the tragedy at Itamar, the massacre at Itamar, my understanding is that both Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad expressed condemnation. Some people have said to me they only expressed that condemnation in English and did not do the same in Arabic. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if you know. But to the extent to which you do know, I want you to address that, and I want you to speak about it in a larger perspective of, do you feel there is enough attempts from within Palestinian leadership to in some way change the mentality on the ground of the average Palestinian?
I'm not 100% sure if they did. I think they did not do it eventually in Arabic, and I think it's definitely something that we need to continue and demand. I have to say that the expressions made by both leaders that you mentioned, Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad, were a testimony, if anything, to the extent of the shock in everybody's mind when we saw those pictures coming out of Itamar, and the realization that no ideology in the world can justify that. And I think that they also understand that very, very well. It's always an issue. It's always a case. We always ask that they do it. Ask yourself this: were they asked to do it by their own media? Was there expectation by their own public for them to do so? So maybe by some elements in that public, but definitely not as in Israel, where everybody expected or expect us to address certain issues, or the leaders to address certain issues, even if it's not convenient and comfortable. Of course, again, I'm not equating anything here, but try and think this. Where is the outcry? Where is the call from the Palestinian journalists? Where is their demand to hear what Mahmoud Abbas has to say in Arabic? He was asked about it in English, so he answered in English. He was asked about it by Israeli media, so he answered to the Israeli media. Again, it's the issue of the culture, the issue of trying and moving forward, trying and getting this freedom that will allow this public sphere to flourish, in which they'll be able to do so. And again, it ties to what you said at the beginning, but it has to be clear that if you're against attacks on innocent civilians, you're against attack on innocent civilians, both when you speak on CNN or on Israeli media, and also when you negotiate your own reconciliation within your own camp, or when you address your own opposition at home. There's one, the issue of Israel, or the issue of terroristic attack against Israel, or the issue of shooting from Gaza into Israel, is the 400-pound gorilla in the room that nobody talks about it seems when there's discussion. It's an issue. I don't think that we are in any position to dictate to the Palestinian leadership what it should do. I think it knows very well what it should do. I think it's only natural for us to expect that. And again, it raises serious questions about this entire Palestinian Authority Hamas negotiations for reconciliation, quote unquote. Who are you reconciling with exactly here? Are you expecting us to continue dealing with you directly when the other party of your reconciliation effort is, again, not recognizing our right to exist before anything else? It's as simple as that. Stop shooting rockets. It's not rocket science. No pun intended. Just stop shooting those missiles into Israel. It's very simple.
Gil Lanier, I've been doing this for a long time. I've spoken to many people in this very building. You are out of this world, and the Israeli consulate in the state of Israel is very lucky to have someone as articulate as you are.
Thank you.
In this position. And I hope you'll let me turn to you often when there are issues that are important to American Jewry, to the American people as a whole, and of course the state of Israel. I appreciate your time, your thinking, and your heart. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. We'll meet often. Thank you, Gil.
It's been my pleasure.
Very much.
Thank you very much.
The thoughts of Gil Lanier, the Consul for Public Affairs here at the Israeli Consulate in New York. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with your own thoughts and comments to the things that Gil had to say. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.